My name is Dr. Ian Storch. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and osteopathic physician, and you are listening to DO or Do Not. If you're interested in joining our team or have suggestions or comments, please contact us at doordonotpodcast.com. Share our link with your friends and like us on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We hope you enjoy this episode.
This is our second Myths and Misconceptions episode. There's a lot of misinformation on osteopathic schools on the internet, and these episodes are aimed at setting things straight. Rather than have me or a member of our team talk about what we think, we feel the best way to address issues is to have an expert speak on the question. In our first episode, we spoke about why so many DO schools have opened up in the past few years. The question we tackle in this episode is there value to an osteopathic medical education? To answer this question, I interviewed Jim Dahle, the white coat investor. Jim is an emergency room physician and an expert on finance, and I thought he was the perfect person to talk about this topic. Although the intent was to talk about osteopathic school, much of the interview focuses on doctor finance, choosing a specialty, lifestyle, and whether going into medicine is a good financial decision. In the interview, we do speak briefly about osteopathic medicine with things such as match rates, as well as Caribbean schools and opportunities that are offered from those institutions. The conversation, however, generally focuses on the finances of being a physician, and as DOs and MDs are both in the same category, there really isn't much difference. This episode was recorded earlier in the year, and although upon re-listening, we don't specifically talk about osteopathic medicine separately from being a doctor, I think that in of itself answers the question. My advice to the listeners is, if you want information about the value of an osteopathic medical education, you might get better advice from a financial expert than a pediatric nephrologist. Jim, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Jim, the last time we had you was 4 years ago when we had just started the podcast. And I think I told you the same thing then. You're a doctor, rock star, celebrity.
I should congratulate you. Do you have any idea how rare this is to go 3 years and still be doing a podcast? That is no small feat. The vast majority of podcasts fizzle out in the first 6 episodes or something, and almost none of them are still around 6 to 12 months later. So going 3 years, you should be congratulated on that.
I appreciate that, Jim. My team is excited. We cycle through students. They graduate. We get new students on, so we always have new blood. And thank God we have a lot of great DOs to interview. And in the same way, we're going to grant you an honorary doctor of osteopathic medicine because you're the only MD we've actually had on the podcast in 130 or 140 episodes.
That's a huge compliment. Thank you very much.
Can you talk to us a little bit, for those that don't know about your podcast and your blog and all the things that you do, can you talk to us and just explain to us what White Coat Investor is, why you started it, and really what the mission of the organization is?
Basically, when I was a resident, I got sick of being ripped off and decided I needed to become financially educated. And as I read books and blogs and participated on online forums, I realized that this stuff's really fun and I really enjoy it and I'm pretty good at it. And I spent less and less time learning and more time helping others. And then about 13 years ago, founded a blog. The same purpose, to help doctors get a fair shake on Wall Street, to help doctors stop doing dumb stuff with their money, whatever you want to call it. This is why it was started. And it started out as a blog, then an email newsletter, and then a podcast, and a bunch of books and online courses. And we have a live conference each year. It's basically whatever format you want to learn financial literacy in, we're going to give you this information in that format. And it's geared mostly at doctors, but it's completely applicable to anybody else in a similar tax bracket, really. It's aimed at high-income professionals, and probably only 5% of it's really doctor-specific. But the idea was give docs a fair shake. The white coat investor was not supposed to be me, right? The white coat investor is supposed to be the audience for the blog and the podcast. But people call me the white coat investor all the time. And I'm like, no, you got it backwards. You're the white coat investor. We're all white coat investors. But the idea behind it is to help doctors become financially literate, become financially disciplined. I just really, truly believe in my heart of hearts that a doctor with their financial ducks in a row is going to be a better physician. They're going to be a better partner. They're going to be a better parent. They can quit worrying about this financial stuff and concentrate on the stuff that really matters, on their patients, on their family, on their own wellness. It's good for burnout. It's good for everything. And so I see no benefit of being financially illiterate. So let's make doctors financially literate.
So Jim, you started helping doctors in 2011. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, I mean, I was doing it informally before then for probably 5 years before that. But that's when the blog was founded. It was 2011. That's when I opened the business and put ads up on the website was May of 2011.
When I started, the blog did not exist. So I'm a little older than that. And I had to go look at books and go to the library and really read when I decided I wanted to increase my financial IQ and how important it was. Before I start going into questions and starting the episode, if someone wanted information or one of our listeners wanted to start, would you recommend the website? Would you recommend buying the book? Would you recommend a course? What do you usually recommend that people start with?
Well, the beautiful thing about a blog is that you can update it and kind of keep it up to date. The lousy thing about a blog, and a podcast is even worse, is it doesn't give you any sort of framework to hang new information on. You learn medicine systematically in medical school. You learn a framework, and then when you get new information, you can add it on to that framework. A blog's not very good at doing that. And so it's good to read a book, to take a course, those sorts of things that give you that basic framework, and then you can add information from a blog or podcast onto that. But the beautiful thing about a blog is it's just-in-time learning. If you just want to learn about one subject, you Google white coat investor in that subject, and there's a blog post written about it. I can assure you, after 3,000 blog posts, there's almost surely something on it that will answer your question.
Jim, the framework of the episode is myths and misconceptions about finances in medicine. And specifically, this is an osteopathic podcast. So we're going to talk about finances for osteopathic school and a DO degree. But in a broad sense, I think we have to start the discussion with just physicians. MDs and DOs are both physicians, and talk a little bit about going to medical school and becoming a physician. So I want to start, I'm going to tell you two personal stories. My wife would say I always bring it back to me, which is probably true, but I'm going to start with two stories and maybe ask you to comment on them. These are things that are very profound to me. So the first one is, when I started dating my wife, she invited us to a wedding of one of her very good friends. And the wedding was one of her best friends and a man who someone had set her up with. And the person that had set the couple up was brought up on the podium by the father-in-law, and he was thanking him for introducing his wife to her husband. And one of the statements that he made, and this is over 20 years ago, but I still remember it. And the husband and wife were both Jewish. And he said, person that had set them up, and I knew him, he's a nice guy. He's in finance. And he said, finance in the year 2006 is to Jewish professionals what a doctor was in the 1980s. And I thought that was really an unfair comment. Now, what are your thoughts on that statement?
It's interesting. There's this idea that there was a golden age of medicine. And it's usually about 5 years before somebody came into practice, is apparently when the golden age ended.
Right.
If ever there was a golden age, the one that stands out for most people is the 80s. Because the rate of increase in the income of the average physician in the 80s was a little bit higher than it was in other decades, in the 60s, 70s, and the 90s, and the 2000s, and the 2010s. But the truth is it's increased over all that time. If you look at an inflation-adjusted income of a doctor today compared to 1960, we make lots more money. So there never really was a true golden age. But I think a lot of people had this idea in the 80s that docs were just raking it in and raking it in. And I think these days you're much more likely to be in finance if you truly have a high 6-figure or 7-figure income.
My other thought, just a comment on this as well, is the reason that somebody goes into medicine goes beyond the earning potential. It's to help society, to help individuals, to heal the sick, all these nice things. So I think that's part of why it bothered me also. Like, you just focus on the finances, but there are other reasons to go into medicine other than return on investment of a medical degree.
Well, hopefully that isn't the top reason. You'll never get through internship if that's your main reason. You'll be sitting there in hour 30 of your 36-hour shift looking at that guy in the bed going, I need the bed more than you do, buddy. Finance isn't going to get you through those sorts of moments. At a minimum, we're talking about 11 years of training. You go do GI, it's 14 years of training. That is not an insignificant portion of your life. And in some ways, it's your best decades, your 20s and your 30s. That takes a lot of sacrifice. I don't think if your goal is to make a lot of money, I think there are better routes you can take starting at age 18, that you can probably be financially independent by the time you would come out of fellowship. So there's got to be a real motivation to actually help people. That stuff you write on that personal statement when you apply to medical school, that you just love science and you want to help people. There's got to be some portion of that that's true, or you're going to be miserable by the time you're in your mid-30s.
So when students are looking at a career, when they're talking about different options in the healthcare profession, so let's say a young person is thinking about becoming a doctor. So they could go to chiropractic school, they could go to podiatric school, they could become a physician, they could become a veterinarian. There are a lot of different types of doctors. And I know there have been people on the podcast that you've spoken to about finances that are not actually physicians, but are different types of practitioners. And I think a lot of us have sort of a misconception about physician salaries and earning potentials versus other types of practitioners, specifically starting with doctors. Can you comment on that and what that looks like?
You know, some people don't want to be and probably shouldn't be a physician for various reasons. It's challenging to be the captain of the ship in a healthcare setting. There's a lot of liability involved. It's a long training period. It's mentally challenging, more so than some other fields. But the truth is, if we're just talking about straight finances, we're talking about the average amount of debt to become this thing versus the average income of those who do this thing. Medicine's at the top. It's better than law in that respect. It's better than pharmacy. It's better than being an advanced practice clinician, a PA or NP of some type. It's better than being a veterinarian. It's better than being a podiatrist. It's better than being an optometrist. If you look at the average debt to the average income ratio, physicians at the top. Dentists have sometimes comparable income. Not on average, but sometimes they do. But the average debt is higher. It's not as good of an investment as going to medical school is. So you got to do what you love and you've got to enjoy your practice. And of course, you've got to get into school. It's no small feat to get into medical school. But I would not feel like medicine is a bad bet compared to just about every other high-income profession. I think it's the best bet out there.
When picking a medical school, so let's say a listener is pre-medical or someone's thinking about medical school and they're choosing a school, there are things to think about like location or what the school offers and obviously cost. Do you have any advice when a student is choosing a school?
I think for most students, you go to the school you get into. It's a very competitive process. I mean, 40% of people who apply to medical school get in somewhere, which means 60% don't get in anywhere. It's hard just to get into one school. So if you get into a school, great, wonderful, go to that school. It's a wonderful thing. Congratulations, you did it. If you are a competitive enough applicant that you can go to more than one school, that is just awesome. And my general rule of thumb for that is go to the least expensive school you get into. And that's not purely a financial recommendation. The truth is that a lot of times the better schools are actually less expensive than the not as good as schools. So I think as a rule of thumb, I think that works. I think there's times like any rule of thumb when it doesn't apply. There's some particular aspect of a school that's a little more expensive that you really like. Maybe it's in a location where your significant other has a job. Maybe it's close to your parents, whatever. Maybe there's a reason to break that rule a little bit. But if you can go to one school that's going to cost you $30,000 a year and another one that's going to cost you $90,000 a year, there probably aren't two schools in the United States where you can justify paying an extra $60,000 times 4 years to get a slightly better education. You probably cannot justify that on a return on investment basis. So that's my general advice. You can look at some schools are better at getting you into different types of programs than others. If you know what you want to do after medical school, then you can go to a medical school that focuses on that. Like the medical school I went to had a really big focus on primary care. I think it would have been a great place to go to medical school if I'd been going into primary care, which I thought I was when I went to medical school, but then changed my mind like many other people halfway through. So I think there's something to be said for trying to match your interests to the school. And some people are just really competitive, right? They get into 6, 7, 8 schools, and usually they've got some idea of where they want to go if they get in there. And so after you get into your top place, you stop interviewing and bothering with the other ones. But I think that's the general process for it. Now, for those who are struggling to get into medical schools, there are other considerations. For example, the classic second chance medical school is to go to the Caribbean. And that's a big gamble. If you look at match rates in the match these days, they're dropping for everybody. But still, if you go to an MD school in the US, you're going to match 91, 92% of the time. Over the last 10 years, the DOs in that match, that rate of matching has risen to be almost equal to that of the MDs, within something like 1 or 2%. They're almost matching all the time. But if you go to Caribbean school, it's a very different proposition. Only about 60 or 62% of those who graduate from a Caribbean medical school are matching. And a whole bunch of people will never make it to graduation that enroll in a Caribbean medical school. That's just a much bigger gamble to borrow $400,000 to pay for a school and then only have a 60% chance of really becoming a practicing doctor. That's a huge gamble. So the only time I would think about maybe holding off on an acceptance I have and applying again the next year might be if the only place I got into was a Caribbean school and I feel like I didn't do a very good job giving my very best shot at applying to medical school, which I think everybody ought to do the first time around. But if you didn't feel like you did that and the only place you got in was a school offshore, I think it might be worth taking another year and applying again.
Cycling from medical school into questions about choosing a specialty. I get a lot of students that I work with on the podcast and in the hospitals. I hear all the time, I want to do orthopedics or I want to do dermatology. And I ask them, well, why do you want to do dermatology? And they're like, oh, because I had bad acne as a kid and I think it would be great. And I think everybody. The question is, I feel like a lot of students, they're saying it's their top choice because they see this list of top paid specialties and these things rank high. Can you give some advice on students that are looking for an idea of what they want to do, how they should select, and how much return on investment, as we were discussing, which changes based on the specialty, should play into that thought?
Yeah, everybody ought to be a dermatologist. Who needs any other kind of doctors, right?
My thought exactly.
I mean, if you do surveys of doctors of various specialties, the dermatologists are the happiest. And that's been true for many years. So I don't blame anybody who wants to go into dermatology. It's very competitive. I think the match rate's like 50% or something in dermatology. It's hard to become a dermatologist. I think partly because there aren't a lot of dermatology emergencies. So your hours are fairly predictable. You tend to do lots of procedures. And so it tends to reimburse pretty well for the amount of hours you're putting in. It's not that long of a training period. My recollection's 4 years, but don't hold me to that. I could be wrong. That's pretty good return on 4-year investment there in a dermatology residency. So I can't blame anybody who wants to be a dermatologist. But if I were a dermatologist, I would probably spend every other weekend in the psychiatric ward because I'd be going nuts. I'd hate it. It is totally not a fit for me. And the most important thing when choosing a specialty is your fit, right? It's got to be something you love. It's got to be something you want to do for the next 15, 20, 30, 40 years. And if you don't love what you do, you're going to be miserable. You only get one life. Do what you want to do. And if that's something that doesn't pay very well, you're far better off in something that doesn't pay very well and doing it for 30 years than you are doing something you hate for 10 years and burning out of it. Now, as far as orthopedics, super interesting. Great specialty. You get to use tools, hammers, saws. It's great. When I was on my ortho rotation as a medical student and I saw the attending consult somebody for a sore throat, I decided maybe that's not the specialty for me. I want to be a little bit broader than that. But the medicine was fascinating. I loved the idea of taking this bone in multiple pieces and trying to figure out the best way to get it back together and restore that function, and you got to really feel like you did something at the end of the day. I mean, I get why people like to do it. It's very competitive. It pays very well. It's quite a bit of training, though. Most of them are doing a fellowship after a long residency. So you got your work cut out for you if you want to be an orthopedist. But I think it's a great specialty. It was probably somewhere in my top 5, I imagine. But again, it wasn't the one that I fit the best with. And I think most people in medical school, they really investigated it and really taken the time to look at themselves, they're going to end up in the right place. And the big regret I have is actually not my top choice specialty, which is what I went into. I'd do that again. But my second choice should not have been OBGYN like it was when I was a medical student. It should have been anesthesia. And I didn't look at anesthesia as closely as I should have. And I think that would have been my second choice. But your second choice doesn't really matter. I still would have ended up in the same place.
A lot of times students will come as a first or a second year and they haven't even done rotations yet. It's try everything on and see what fits. Do you agree with that?
I mean, I think that's the best approach. I loved everything in my third year of medical school except my psychiatry rotation. And then I ended up in emergency medicine where 50% of my patients have a psychiatric comorbidity. So you never know where you're going to end up. But it's hard to really know for sure until you've done rotations, and particularly done a rotation in your chosen specialty. So the earlier you can get exposure to what you think you're interested in, the better. I remember as a second year, I loved neuroscience block. I thought it was super interesting. And so I went to a neurology clinic and followed a neurologist around. And 2 hours later, I knew I wasn't going to be a neurologist. And so you got to do those things when you're a first year, when you're a second year, certainly by the time you're a third year, you've got to be really looking hard at what you want to do the rest of your life. And you might be surprised, just because you like learning about something doesn't mean you'll actually like doing it.
Jim, I want to cycle into a blog post that I read about low-income doctors. And basically, you started off with the statement that the average doc makes $275,000, which was in 2021. Obviously, that may have changed. I'm going to quote you. You said, "I don't feel bad for doctors that have relatively low income," which I just think is a great statement. I want to talk about that a little more before I open up for comments from you on the statement that you made, which I love. There was a recent book, follow-up book of Housel, which is called Same as It Ever Was, where I think it's very apropos to some of the comments that you make. He talks about the fact that in the United States, we always think fondly on the 1950s. And we think that was like the golden age of the United States because everybody came back from the war and everybody bought these beautiful houses and had cars and all these great things. And he says that in reality, the per family income decade by decade since the 1950s, adjusted for inflation, has actually increased every decade. So we're actually doing better in the United States for an average family every 10 years, but we still think the 50s were the best. And his theory is that the reason why the 50s are felt to be the best is because everybody had the same thing. So nobody was looking at the guy next door and saying, the dermatologist has a Ferrari and I only have a Porsche. It was like everybody had a Caddy or something. So can you talk a little bit about that comment? I don't feel bad for doctors that have relatively low income.
Well, first of all, I've learned to quit using the phrase low-income doctors. We've changed that. We now say moderate income doctors.
That's great.
There really aren't very many low-income doctors, to be honest with you. Now, that full phrase, I believe, is that I don't feel badly for low-income doctors. I feel badly for low-income doctors with a big fat debt. Because you can have a very nice life on $150,000, $200,000, $250,000 a year. You can live very well, unless you got to make student loan payments on a $400,000 student loan, or you got to have a $2.5 million mortgage in the Bay Area. Then it doesn't work out very well. So that's, I think, where that statement was coming from. I fully agree with Morgan, though, about this glorification of the 1950s. I think the statistics are that on an inflation-adjusted basis, the average family in the 1950s had an income of $29,000 or $30,000 in today's dollars. That's what they were living on. And so that's why they all lived in 800 square foot houses, one after another down the block, 800 square foot houses and a relatively inexpensive car without all the features that our cars have today. Today's average household income is more like $70,000. It's dramatically better lifestyle. We've all got the world's accumulated knowledge on a 6-inch device in our pockets. We go to the four corners of the earth for a fraction of a month's pay on a jet airliner. I mean, it's incredible the wealth that we have in the world on average, but particularly in the United States these days. And it helps if we remember that rather than just looking at the people who are doing better than us and feeling sorry for ourselves.
Just to finish off that topic, I was speaking to someone who's actually a pediatric nephrologist, and they were saying maybe they wish they had done something else because their earning potential could have been greater. But the physician seems very happy with their career. They're well loved at the institution that they work at. They win teaching and attending of the year every year. You would say that person should be happy as a pediatric nephrologist and not wishing they had done orthopedics first, assuming that that wasn't the love of their life.
One of the worst parts about medicine is that pay structure in medicine doesn't necessarily reward those who are doing something that is badly needed, where there aren't very many specialists in that field. It doesn't necessarily reward you for training for a long time, for doing 5 or 6 or 7 years of training. It's a little bit more random that way. Procedures tend to pay better than thinking. Adult specialties tend to pay better than pediatric specialties. Payer mix has a big effect on it. Whether you're in academics or private practice has a big effect on it. In many ways, it's not fair. It's not fair. So I feel badly about that. At the same time, don't have any good method to make it fair. And I think that medical students choosing a specialty ought to know the ways in which the world they're entering is not fair. So at least they can make an informed decision and then lie in the bed that they made. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that the inter-specialty variation, we all see these charts on a Medscape salary survey or something, and we see that on average, an orthopedist makes twice as much as a pediatrician. But what nobody ever shows you is that the intra-specialty pay variation is even greater than that. I know pediatricians making 7 figures. I know pediatricians making 5 figures. I know orthopedists making 7 figures. I know orthopedists making less than $150,000 a year. So there's this huge variation in pay for the various doctors in your specialty. And so I think if making more money is particularly important to you for whatever reason, there are ways to do that in whatever specialty you've chosen. Now, it's a little harder in some specialties than others. If you're a pediatric rheumatologist, you're probably associated with an academic medical center. You're probably going to be an academic doc, but not all of them are. You can go out and open your own practice and have people working for you and scale it up and make it a concierge practice. There are other ways to increase your income if that's what's important to you.
I've been doing my homework for this interview. I've been looking at all the resources on the White Coat Investor website, which are all great. One of the figures that really stood out to me that I thought was very eye-opening is the salary per hour, like the hourly rate for doctors. I think that's such a great chart because sometimes I feel like you just look at a doctor and, for example, I'm in private practice and maybe I do a little better than someone who worked for an institution, but I have a lot of administrative burden that's not compensated for, where I'm running the practice, setting up the practice, working with my office manager to do payroll and silly things like this. And the actual number doesn't really speak to the number of hours that I'm putting in. Can you just talk a little bit about really comparing apples to apples and looking at a salary per hour? Do you think that's important?
I think it's a really interesting number to look at. And I've looked at it before. It's hard to get all the data you need to really compare it. Emergency medicine, my field, has what I consider to be one of the best hourly rates for years of training that you went through. A typical emergency doc, the low end's probably making $175, $180 an hour. At the high end, might be making $400 an hour after a 3-year residency. It's a fantastic hourly rate. Many other specialists are not making that sort of an hourly rate, even many surgeons. They're making more money, yes, but they're working 50% more. And so you do have to consider those sorts of things as well. But in every specialty, There are ways to increase your hourly rate. I mean, we all know a GI doc who spends 4 days a week scoping for dollars and 1 day a week in clinic, or he has a bunch of APCs covering clinic or whatever. And boy, if you are doing a colonoscopy every 25 minutes or whatever, I don't know how long it takes to do a colonoscopy. I was asleep, but if you're doing one colonoscopy every 25 minutes all day, you're going to bill a lot of relatively high paid hours during that day and that week. And so there are ways to structure a practice that you can increase that hourly pay. But at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, well, why did I go into this? What do I hope to accomplish for my career? What do the patients most need? And you got to balance that with your financial goals. You certainly don't want to be one of those doctors that's under so much financial pressure that you're not doing the right thing for the patients.
Jim, I just had a scenario, I think, that typifies exactly what you just said. Sometimes the surgical residents will rotate through my office. They'll observe me doing procedures in the office, which for a gastroenterologist is really where the money, as you're saying, that's where most of our revenue comes from. And I had a patient in the hospital, a patient of mine for a long time, who was having a GI bleed, and surgery was called. And the same surgical resident who had recently rotated through my office came and wanted to watch me do the procedure on the patient that was bleeding. And, we went into the room. We sat there for a few hours waiting for the procedure to go in, as typically happens for procedures in the hospital. And then he went in with me and we did the procedure. And we came out, he looked at me and said, "Stuart, why would you even come to the hospital to do this procedure? It just took you like 2 hours to do the colonoscopy. And I know when I'm there in the office, as you said, it takes 30 minutes of procedure. You could have had 4 procedures done in the same amount of time." And I just smiled and I told him I went into medicine to be a physician. This is my patient. And if he needs a screening colonoscopy, I'll do it. And if he's bleeding in the hospital, I'm happy to come take care of him. There are many GIs, I think, that would not do that and don't keep hospital privileges. But as you're saying, it just depends on how you want to build your practice and which parts of medicine. I think that's the sum of our whole discussion. You have to figure out which parts of medicine are important to you and what makes you happy when you close your eyes to go to bed, that you did a good job or that you made the most money or your goals in life are.
And the beautiful thing about becoming financially literate, becoming financially disciplined, if you have the combination of those two things in today's world, it's like having a superpower. It's so rare out there that somebody has both of those things. But if you tab both of those things from early in your career and you apply it to a physician income, it does not take that long to be a millionaire and then a multimillionaire and then financially independent, probably by the time you're at mid-career. And at that point, now your decisions have no financial impact on your life. You can do exactly the right thing for the patient. If the patient needs you to stand around while the nurses and the anesthesiologists fart around getting them ready for the procedure, you can afford to do that. In my specialty, it's 2 hours staying after shift to take care of somebody that's not paying for their visit anyway and getting them placed into whatever they might need. But every specialty's got that stuff that doesn't reimburse very well, but is absolutely necessary for the patient. And you can do more of that without having to worry about the financial consequences of it once you have your financial ducks in a row. If you're saving enough for retirement, if you took care of your student loans early, if you have adequate disability and life insurance, and if you're building wealth and retiring debt and can provide this wonderful life for your family and still practice in the way that you need to, then it's just a beautiful life. On the other hand, there's all these doctors living paycheck to paycheck and they're mid-career. They still haven't built any wealth. And you know what? The financial ramifications of the decisions they make every day have a very real impact on their lifestyle and how long they'll have to work. And I just wish that wasn't true for any doctor.
So Jim, just bringing it full circle, thank you. I know your time is limited and valuable, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. We generally don't endorse products or services, but to me, there's no question that the things that White Coat Investor provides would have been invaluable to me, remembering that I went to the library and took out 50 books. I don't think medical students, pre-medical students, or residents at this point even know what a book is. Everything's online. But if I just had one resource where I could at least start my journey and figure out what questions I should be asking, no question, the value of what you do. So if a student or someone listening wanted to get a hold of resources, let's say they wanted to start with a book or with a course, where would they go to do that? How would they start their journey?
Whitecoatinvestor.com is the hub for everything, whether you're looking for a blog or podcast or book or a course. But the beautiful thing about it is it's obviously a business. We have ads on the website and we sell products, conference, we sell online courses, we sell books. But you don't have to be there very long before you catch on that there's a real missionary zeal, not only in my efforts to do it, but in the efforts of all of our staff members. Yeah, we got to make payroll. They want to make money every month. No one wants to work for free. But there's a real missionary zeal in just getting this information out there. And 98% of what we do is totally free to anybody who wants to wander in and learn. That's really all it takes. If you're interested in learning this stuff, we will teach it to you at whatever price you want to pay, including nothing.
Can't beat nothing, Jim. That's great.
It's my favorite price.
Jim, again, thank you for spending time with us. I definitely appreciate it, and I know our listeners will too.
Thank you. It's good to be back on your podcast.
This concludes our episode of Do or Do Not. Send all inquiries, comments, suggestions, and even let us know if there's someone you want us to interview to doordonotpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Do or Do Not Podcast for updates. If you enjoyed our podcast, please share it with your classmates and administration. We have plenty of more interviews lined up, and we're excited to share them with you. This is Tian Yu Shea. Thank you guys so much for listening to Do or Do Not.